Welcome to the 24th Miami Jewish Film Festival. I'm Alfred Soto, a local music journalist and instructional professor at FIU. And I'm pleased to have a conversation with Oliver Murray about the film RONNIE'S that's premiering at this year's festival. How are you doing, Oliver?
Hey, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you guys for watching the movie.
No, thank you for being here. So RONNIE'S presents a really, for me at least, an extraordinary portrait of a time and a place not often shown on film, let alone discussed in articles. So before we get into some of the specifics of what you uncovered in your documentary, please give us a brief synopsis. Who was Ronnie Scott, and why did his club exert such a fascination for American jazz giants?
Well, I think the important thing to understand about Ronnie when looking at him with contemporary eyes is he's a kid from the East End of London, in notoriously one of the poorest parts of London after the Second World War, where the East End and the south of London was heavily bombed. So there was very little infrastructure, very little opportunity. And people went one of two ways. I think they either gave up on their dreams, or in Ronnie's case, did it simply for the love of, in his case, the saxophone and music. And he's a guy who followed a dream. And I think what's kind of interesting about a lot of those people from that era is that became actually the reason why it was financially viable to as much of an extent as a jazz club can be, which, as people that have seen the movie know, it is tricky. But he's a guy that wouldn't take no for an answer, had an infectious enthusiasm, and a group of friends and musicians who together carved out a little piece of the set of Soho in the center of London to play music for themselves.
And so one of the things that fascinates me as a writer, as a critic, is the economics of culture, right? The economic part. And what was it like at the level of pop culture in the late 50s, early 60s in Britain? So we're talking now about 10 to about 15 years after the end of the World War II. So was there a disposable income available to Londoners to spend money on an evening out at a jazz club?
Yes, I think there was. I mean, I guess London, like New York, I'd say, or Paris to an extent, these are places that are so big, and it kind of depends who you're talking to, but definitely in Soho, which is geographically, it's in the center of London, it'd be classed as the West End, which is often a bit confusing because it's not West at all. And if you go looking for Theatreland, I guess is another name for Soho. So that was this kind of amazing. It's not very big, but it's I think it has the highest number of theaters, which certainly does at the moment. Obviously it's always vying for that title between London and New York, but it has at Ronnie's kind of time, anything from a flea pit, little spit and sawdust stage, as we call it, or the big, by royal appointment kind of places, beautiful interiors and proper gala stages. So it had a bit of everything. And I think if you were a lord or a lady, that you had a particular night, and about 50 feet away you could go into a basement and get up to all sorts of notoriety and trouble.
So can you explain the British jazz scene in the late 50s and early 60s? And I ask you that because jazz emerged from such a specific American socio-political context, right? It's this often unwieldy nexus of segregated entertainment.
Yep.
the artistic nourishment provided by these same spaces for these performers of color,
Yeah.
which are at the same time funded by the curiosity of white listeners.
Yeah.
But that's an American context. Was there any similarities or differences with the British audience?
I think the simple truth is that everything about what was going on in Britain at that time was a inferior imitation of what was going on in the US, especially when you talk about jazz, and especially there's an interesting there's an interested young bunch of guys and girls with their ears open to all these new sounds, and crucially, during the war, American GIs flooded through London and Europe, and that's how they heard these records and things like that. But it was all pointing towards what was coming out of the US, and people would mail out for these white labels or whatever records that would take 6 weeks to turn up. And as you know, I think one of the biggest testaments to how crucial it was for these guys, mostly guys, to they had to go to New York any way possible. That was the Mecca. That was the lifeline, was the transatlantic liners that came back and forth between London and Liverpool. And that's why the Beatles explode out of Liverpool. It's not because there was something there already, it's because that was where the shipping lanes were between the US. And so they heard these sounds, and everything. Even there's a couple of guys like, if you go to I find it very interesting, you go to an American jazz store, there's two guys, there's Ronnie Scott and there's Tubby Hayes. I think we had one guy called Tubby Hayes, who I try and nod to in the film because he's a huge deal in Britain, and jazz enthusiasts know him in America, but he's no Charlie Parker and Dizzy and all those guys. They were leaps and bounds ahead.
Yeah, and that second-handedness you mentioned, the second-hand attitude that a lot of British musicians had toward American music, is a vein that runs through much British music up through the 80s, actually. It's just looking at my own work and my own writing about this era, and Ronnie's precedes a lot of the rock and roll stuff, but the second-handedness of and the received nature a lot of this American music's coming in, whether through Liverpool or through other means, is both an impediment but also a kind of a spur, right? Because if you embrace, not so much from an ironic point of view, but if you embrace that detachment, you're able to create your own kind of music within it. So I'm curious to know, and your documentary kind of touches on this, what was the relationship between the acts and the ethos that the club tried to foster and its own relation to so-called genuine jazz? And I place that under quotation marks because I don't want to get into authenticity discussions, but at the same time, it is unavoidable, right? Because you have,
yes,
and that's why I was careful to say there's a specific context out of which jazz emerges in the United States, which Britain didn't have.
yes.
How is that received by both, Ronnie Scott and his contemporaries, and also the customers and patrons coming to his club?
Well, I think it starts in its bones, in the DNA of it. It starts with bebop, with Charlie Parker. I think whether you know it or not, I think you could talk about the origins of punk starting with someone like, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, because it's not a music
or Nick Coleman.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's with someone like Charlie Parker, it's not music you dance to. It's music that you sit and you listen to quite intensely. So I think there was what was that there was a genuine appetite, a sort of pretty furious appetite to consume these sounds, and a bohemian kind of Soho in London is what the West Village was, you know, in New York, I suppose. So there's more of a link than you think to begin with. Maybe a kind of an intellectual link to this sort of music as well. There was an amazing it kind of all the freaks and geeks were at Ronnie's. You know, it's that kind of that place where it was a place for outsiders and people that didn't fit, and for all sorts of reasons became a place of acceptance. So that culturally speaking, that's what it offered. And then musically speaking, Ronnie Scott and Pete King made sure that they were creating the near perfect environment for the best possible performance. And I think that's, and including things like when Sonny Rollins went, he went there for a month. It just said Sonny Rollins on the door for a month. And I mean, it doesn't happen now. It barely happened then at the time as well. So it's basically saying, look, guys, come over. This isn't just a gig. This is hopefully something that you remember as, you know, your time in London, a month-long residency at Ronnie's, where you can get used to the room, get used to the culture, and they kind of win because they get the best of the musicians, and the musicians win because they get these amazing experiences. And I think it was that interplay between the musicians and the crowds, the musicians knowing that they were being given a great opportunity and the crowds knowing that they were getting the best performances. And it was that symbiotic relationship that is, I think, kind of at the core of why Ronnie's is still there now. That timeless, the musics can change, the music changes, the taste changes, but it's that relationship between artist and audience that they get so right.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how these periods of, let's call them cultural ascendancy or kind of cultural fecundity, all require a fusion of the other arts, right? So I'm thinking of swinging London about 6-7 years later, right? And the period of Ronnie's, you know, when he opened the club and what was going on at the time, you have the Angry Young Men, right? You have John Osborne and Alan Sillitoe and directors like Tony Richardson. So suddenly the British arts, whether in playwriting or in filmmaking, suddenly start to have a kind of transatlantic appeal. Mm-hmm. So I wonder to what degree the establishment of a strong, fertile British cultural scene was able to act as a magnet, attracting talent from America.
That's a great question, and one I don't really have a good answer to. But I think the two things are in a way separate, because
Fair, yeah.
Ronnie's was, I mean, they're both, I think that was a huge attraction to come to swinging London at the time. And it did bring all sorts of interesting people, you know, obviously Jimi Hendrix, who makes an appearance in the film, that's where he chooses to be at that time.
That was fascinating, by the way. We'll get to that later. That's
yeah. So I think from Ronnie Scott's perspective, actually, I think that as that was happening, he was quite content to remain slightly old world. I mean, not that old world. It's like 5 minutes ago, but in that environment, 5 minutes ago is old news. You know, it's this
sure.
Big thing. So the fact that it was, 6 years old by the the mid 60s, they weren't about to be affected by what was going on around them in that way. They still had one foot in the old era of what was going on. I think that was the appeal to the Beatles famously went there to kind of expand their horizons for things like harmonies and trying to bend the ear of a lot of these musicians, talking about expanding their sound from the kind of the mop top era into the more colorful sound. So I think Ronnie's it had an upstairs that if it, a bit like, you know, Paris at the turn of the century had all those painters, and New York had the punk scene going on. I think there was a moment in Swinging London where upstairs at Ronnie's, you may well have got, you know, the Beatles talking to Sonny Rollins about, you know, chords and harmony and all that sort of stuff. So it would certainly have been a great place to be.
Yeah, and it is quite normal in the arts to have these so-called fellow travelers, right? People who are not part of the scene directly, or in the case of Ronnie Scott, just a little bit older,
Yeah.
who are benevolent figures, right? You know, I think of even someone at the same time, someone like a Richard Burton, the actor,
Yeah.
just a little bit older than those angry young men, but was able to exploit a lot of the same sessions and trends. So it's not something I've realized that you plan. You just happen to be, it's a kind of kismet, right? You're at the right place and the right time. And Ronnie's was at the period at which many of these cultural upheavals were happening. And the kind of jazz that was featured in this club happened to be maturing at the same time that rock and roll was too. So whether he wanted to or not, his club was there. His club was part of it, in part because it was in the same way that Burton or these other figures, fellow travelers, the club was too. So you have a Paul McCartney who was constantly trying to expand his ideas of what harmonically you could do in a rock song, was visiting the club and going, you know, this is there's a bloodline here, and there's a main line that I can, from which I can draw something that I can funnel back into my own group. So that's something your documentary really nails, that you have, if you're interested, if you're looking at it almost from an ageist point of view, like, oh, what are these old timers doing at the club? It's like, well, but they were also at the peak of their careers, and it's jazz doesn't work in the same way that rock or pop does. That like poets, you're often in your 40s, 50s, or even 60s creating your best work. And that's what I loved about what you presented about this club going well into the late 70s and early 80s.
I know. I think it's the place to see if you've really got what it takes. I mean, it's hard to explain until you've stood on that stage. It's incredibly intimate. It's 200 capacity, and it's just known in the musical community that it's just one of the stages that, because of its heritage, because of there's a kind of intensity that you need to bring, and it makes or breaks you. And I think a lot of people wait because they don't want to break and go through. I mean, God, if failing at Ronnie's, I won't say names. I've seen a couple of people just go too early. It was the general kind of, you know, chat after the gig. It was sort of like, you know, maybe a bit later, maybe a couple, you know, jumped the gun and went too early because it's brutal.
Yeah, yeah, and there's something I thought of as I was watching Ronnie's, and to me, it's an unavoidable question, and it has to do also, once again, with the socio-cultural context from which jazz emerges in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with what Philip Larkin wrote about jazz in the 60s and 70s. And it's, to me, it's, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's some fascinating. Yeah, so Philip Larkin, the poet, also wrote a jazz column. And he was, and there's no mincing words, he was a racist. His letters are just vile. Yet he evinced a profound appreciation for jazz in those columns and essays that he published. So I was curious about what kind of racist or racial subtext had to do with the way Ronnie's gained a following in London. I mean, and was there any of that? Was there any kind of, because this was as prevalent, maybe not as overt as an American culture, but certainly as the empire starts to crumble, some of the racist attitudes in the ruling class, the gentry, start to emerge. So I wonder the kind of conflict between the egalitarian nature of Ronnie's and parochial nature of much of the British public.
I mean, I'm sure there was a tension. It's kind of tricky to when you're making a documentary like this. It was a rare thing in the 50s for cameras to be around. It's not like now where, you know, we're doing this or whatever, and it's relatively straightforward to have an open conversation like this. I think I'm always aware, making archival documentaries, that even if it's not staged, you got one chance with one reel of film. You had 3 minutes to say what you wanted to say. So that's why everyone in the past seems to be incredibly eloquent. And do you know what I mean? When you see these older interviews and you go, oh my God, it's because they knew 2 weeks in advance or whatever that they were going to have their one shot. You couldn't say, oh, well, we'll just wipe that and we'll go again. So I wouldn't say that going through the experience of putting this film together qualifies me to be able to answer that question properly. But I would say that there was something remarkably warm and magic about what I did hear from these people, was that they were united by this love for music, first and foremost, in all of its forms. And I think jazz, sometimes it's considered to be this quite academic and guarded medium, but what I really hope people get from this film, and in a way it's kind of become one of my I don't want to say mission, but one of my hopes, is that a film like this breaks down the idea that jazz isn't for you, because it kind of is for everybody, because of the way that it is so accepting of new sounds. It stands to reason. It's always wanting to be new. It's always wanting to be inclusive and investing in opportunities to interrogate new sounds and new cultures. And I think that is also at the heart of the relationships between people. As you say, it is odd. It's just odd in not just in jazz, but in all sorts of ways, to discover that some people are, on the one hand, diehard jazz fans or sports fans, but deeply racist, even though the best player on the team that they love is black. And they'd be able to, it's tricky. And I just have to chalk it off as something that I'll never really understand. I wasn't there, and I have to say I'm not qualified to really comment, other than it perplexes me still how you can draw a line down the middle of something that just seems to be completely impossible to split. But they did, didn't they?
Yeah, and if you read, and I urge you to do so if you have not, what Philip Larkin and his friend Kingsley Amis would say to each other, horrifying things about Black men and women generally, but yet write paragraphs in praise of Charlie Parker and Miles Davis. And it's, I guess, never underestimate the human capacity for compartmentalizing, right?
Yeah.
Or creating exceptions, right? These people are the exception to the right. So, and I think, again, your documentary touches on this, because it's inevitable watching this if this is happening. But let me move on to something else, but it is related. So your film mixes the splendid archival footage with fresh interviews. And I was particularly taken with Van Morrison performing Send in the Clowns, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what year it is. What year is that, by the way? Do you know?
80s.
80s, okay. Yeah. I looked at him and said, yeah, he was already entering his sort of new age phase. and Ella Fitzgerald performing My Man. I think that was also in the early 80s or late 70s.
That's right, late 70s. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and in an email to me, you said you finished the film, or had stopped thinking about the film roughly about 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how accessible was the footage from Ronnie as you were able to weave in, and did you interview anyone during COVID?
Well, some of this material, it's an odd thing. This film was odd because a lot of the material was sort of hiding in plain sight.
Right.
It was a strange one. Some of it, the Miles Davis performance, we basically we didn't discover it, but we found it and had to digitize it ourselves. So that was a highlight. That's
Yeah.
that was really something to walk in with a little reel under my arm and have that scanned and all that stuff is a real, one of the real pleasures of archive filmmaking is restoring these otherwise forgotten bits of material and being able to put something really special in your film. And the Hendrix bootleg recording, that was mad because that was just a guy. This is another thing I don't really understand. Can you imagine today going into a club with any recording device, let alone in those days a recording device that's the size of a small briefcase, and they're just totally cool about it?
Yeah.
No one at the club's like, you can't record Mr. Hendrix this evening. They're like, no, it's like, totally no problem. But getting all of that stuff in is also all due to, I can have all the creative kind of opinions in the world, but unless I have a really fantastic music supervisor and a really fantastic archive producer and an archive researcher who can actually pin this down and secure the rights, it's you're on a road to nowhere. So I have to thank my team for backing me up. I throw these little opportunities over my shoulder to them, and they go away. And as if to me, it's as if by magic, it's we're allowed to use it. But that's a skill in itself. And the second part of your question was no, we didn't do any interviews during COVID. It was literally we finished just in time for the whole world to shut down, basically. But we got a theatrical release in the UK in October, in between our first and our second lockdown, and here we are today, which was this screening will be our first physical screening in the US, which it's happened. It's a big deal because we made it for the big screen, as I hope everyone can tell, with a huge amount of restoration, and that footage really does look fantastic. Again, it's a great post-production team, and I hope it has a long life all over the place, all over the world.
Yeah, and when I was watching particularly the Ella Fitzgerald performance, I immediately thought of, and I don't know if you've seen it, in 2019, there was that documentary of Aretha Franklin's gospel performance. And I saw that in the theater, in a multiplex, actually, in our big national chain AMC. And we're these days accustomed to watching things on YouTube, whether on our phones or on TV. But watching this on the screen, watching, in that case, Aretha, but watching that 2.5 minute clip of Ella singing was it just sort of blew me away that the performer's capacity to overwhelm was not, it surpassed what you can see on one of these things right here, right? And I'm happy that without, again, in a sense that you can't plan these things, that your film comes out a little over 2 years after that Aretha film, and this is what you can do. You can recontextualize this archival footage and present it, and you can see facets of these brilliant performers' lives that would have been buried in YouTube. You're able to just pull them out and tell a story
Yeah.
and weave them together as a kind of narrative chain. And it works beautifully.
Well, thank you. That was the aim, and that was actually the thing that I was most nervous about when we started, was going into it. I mean, going into it, I am not a jazz expert by any means. I was really interested because actually when the producers said, what would my take be? I said, well, I think I am like a lot of people who honestly don't really know who Ronnie Scott is. I know Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club,
Right.
and this is in the UK. I'm thinking, you say Ronnie Scott, I think, well, it's a club. So I'm sure there was a guy called Ronnie Scott who started it, and it was.
Sure.
So I started from a place of I am the audience for this film, in a lot of ways. So there was kind of that, and this idea of, I wanted to make sure that the two things, that the story of Ronnie and these performances didn't clash, because I think it would be easy to not make the mistake, but there was no guarantees when we started that was going to happen easily. And it was, once you understand how music was Ronnie's medicine, and what you get as an audience member watching Ella, it's just that I think the word that always comes to mind about that performance is control.
Yes.
Just control of her voice, control
Yes.
of the stage, control of the interactions. That she tells stories in 3 minutes, 4 minutes when she sings, and I just thought, we're going to be fine, because music is Ronnie's medicine. And sitting and watching her and all these other performers in the cinema is what he was doing every night.
Yeah.
So by the time the movie finishes, and we start to hear, Ronnie's fate, his, the sad conclusion to his life, you kind of realize that he is us in that sense, and I think that's why it resonates. That's certainly how it resonates for me. It's as close as you're ever going to get to going to Ronnie's, this film, I think.
And that's your last point is salient, because people tend to think of jazz as one kind of sound, this monolith, right? And I appreciated how you placed the Ella Fitzgerald and Van Morrison performances together to see, from my point of view, a study in contrasts, right? Mm-hmm. For me, you're entirely correct when you said that Ella Fitzgerald, you can see her immediate, unforced connection to her audience, right? She's playing off the audience, right? The cadences of her voice, a song she's performed perhaps hundreds of times, suddenly changed in front of that club.
Yeah.
Whereas someone like a Van Morrison has always, for me at least, been an example of a kind of glorious self-absorption.
Yeah.
He doesn't give a shit about the audience. He's there in his vanness, his vanity, pardon the pun, in his little bubble, right? For him, it could be Ronnie's and it could be Madison Square Garden. It doesn't really make a difference. But yet at Ronnie's, it acts as a kind of continuum. You saw over the era, you saw how this performer whose peak I should say her glory days was in the 40s, and then the performer who is still, I don't know if in his peak, but close to his peak in the 80s, he still got it. And using their wildly different methods are able to translate their art to this audience. And that leads me to my next question. I was wondering, Ronnie's endured this patchy, fallow financial period, right, until Chris Blackwell came to the rescue. I'm not sure how many members of our audience are aware of what a scion Chris Blackwell is in the music biz, and why it meant something. I didn't know that. When watching the documentary, I had no idea that he was involved so heavily in trying to establish a solid financial basis for the club. So can you clarify what happened and also explain who Chris Blackwell was?
Yeah, well, I'll try. This is where if you scratch at my understanding too much, there's you won't find a huge amount below the surface. But Chris Blackwell, the founder of Island Records, I lived in Jamaica for a long time now, and was obviously synonymous with Bob Marley's success and U2, and I think he's quite happy to be in the background compared to some other moguls. But I mean, he's right up there. I mean, you have to include him as one of the biggest influences on music. I think there's, the Ertegun brothers in the 50s are in New York, and then there's also and he, I think it was a combination of the fact that he was living in Jamaica. So I think Ronnie's was one of the places that when he came back, he wanted to keep it there. So I think he almost, wanted his favorite drinking hole to stay open. So he spent a fortune because he could.
Totally get that.
Yeah. So there's a couple of places that I'd quite like to keep open, but I don't have the financial clout of a major music mogul. So he I think that was a large part of it. But also by that time, it was becoming a real showcase for artists. And to your point with like Van, for instance, a lot of people were going there in that era at the end of their careers. The kind of stripped back acoustic version of a glittering electric career, for instance. That was something that Chris Blackwell ushered in as well. This kind of like, I suppose, something akin to the era of MTV Unplugged. Something like it was the let's go and see the Unplugged hero.
Right.
And that was a fantastic kind of business opportunity, as well as a means to guarantee he never has to buy a drink at his favorite club ever again. So that was the Chris Blackwell story.
So as usual, it's a combination of generosity and selfishness, and that's what motivates most.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Ronnie certainly understood that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a funny thing. Ronnie's loved that place so much, but at the same time, didn't look after it from a financial perspective.
Sure.
He sort of relied on others to do the books and all that sort of stuff. But as is often the way, there's someone who's front of house, is the figurehead and the charisma, and then he's very, very lucky that he had Pete King, his best friend, and the guy that basically gave up music in order to run it as a business.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the King and also Ronnie's own musician talents, right? So he was a saxophonist, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and that part of your documentary also fascinates me, right? So I'm just extrapolating here. So part of why he invests spiritually, aesthetically into his club is that he's trying to, in a sense, find a larger stage to share his own talents. How did Ronnie's own musical abilities rate against some of his contemporaries? I mean, we're not talking about compositional ability. I'm talking as a tenor saxophonist.
As a player.
Yeah.
Well, he was, I mean, definitely. I mean, if you talk about the polls, we don't really have those anymore. But it's funny looking back through things like in London, there was like Melody Maker and Jazz News, and then the NME came a little bit later after that. They had these kind of polls so you could say a bit like a sports league, where
right.
He was top of those. So yes, I guess as I say, there's another guy called Tubby Hayes who he went to New York as a player and was kind of accepted as, you know, as a real player. And I don't think Ronnie was quite there. But that's a bit like saying, you know, a boxer isn't Muhammad Ali. You know, they could still be. So he was the UK's second best saxophone player under someone who was genuinely is still considered to be the greatest saxophone player that the UK has ever produced. And I mean, Ronnie toured. That's how he met Quincy Jones. He toured in Paris. He went through Europe and down to Australia. So he was internationally recognized. But it is impossible by the late 60s to separate him from his club and the attraction of that. So, and as you know from the film, it was something that he was a bit, you know, it cut him up a bit near the end. You know, was he a saxophone player or was he a kind of front of house comedian? Because people loved his jokes and people came to see him present the night, the audience as well, you know, so they came to see him. But yeah, it's a shame because I think that clouded his judgment of the other things that he succeeded at. He wanted to be known as a saxophone player, but I think he will be known as a club owner.
Sure, and that's inevitable. That happens with a lot of impresarios or actually just about any field, right? It's what I like to call the B-side syndrome, right? That a man spends weeks, months crafting an album, crafting something that's supposed to be immortal. And the song on which they spent 15 minutes, they cranked it out, becomes the biggest hit.
Yeah.
And with Ronnie, I wonder to what extent, and your documentary just touched on this, to what extent knowing that he's the second best musician, jazz musician in England, didn't eat away at him, right? And that led to his alcohol problems and depression and so forth, that I'm just a club guy, I'm not a musician, right? And the musician's almost this dilettantish pleasure you do, you know, for your family and friends.
I think he'd earned the respect of the musical community. And there's a lovely bit in the film where, you know, Oscar Peterson is describing him as a saxophone player as well. And I think that it was that kind of thing that meant he made peace with that. The sad thing was just how much he needed to play for his health,
right,
as an outlet. So I think primarily that was the tragedy about his playing. I don't think he cared what other people thought by the end. I think he was a known figure throughout London, the UK, and internationally. I don't think that was the problem. I think he had these horrendous problems with his teeth that just meant that he couldn't that was his way of processing mental anguish. Depression, what we now know as a disease, was something that if you were having a bit of a black mood, as it was called, the
black dog.
Yeah. And people would say, oh, get him a drink, which we now know is the worst thing that you can do.
No.
And so, I mean, the weather's not exactly the best in London, even in the summer. But if you imagine, it's like perpetual night for a guy like him, a jazz musician, surrounded by booze and drugs. And, there was obviously there's a heavy cocaine use in that kind of environment as well. And he loses his ability to play it out, as Mary says, his partner. He played his emotions out until he was physically unable to, and he did not last much longer after that, unfortunately.
I love that I'm glad you mentioned the teeth, that bit of levity documentary was just, but the degree to which this, what looks like a frivolous point, becomes something that's awe-consuming,
Yeah.
especially in the way in which it coincides with other manias and phobias and neuroses of Ronnie himself. Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys once referred to, yes, British teeth. We all have them, and we're all trying to scrub them off in some fashion. So I wonder if it's some sort of generational thing, that the self-consciousness about the teeth.
Yeah, once you start really looking at all the video material of Ronnie, he's also he's smoking, I think, from the age of about 14, and that can't be good for your teeth and your gums.
No.
And terrible. So I think that it's a contradiction, isn't it? It's the thing that's most precious to you is the thing
Exactly.
that you let go of at the same time. It's bizarre. But depression is bizarre as well in so many ways, and in how people react to it. So as I say, as soon as he lost his embouchure, that because it's not, because there's playing and then there's playing. I think it was more I'm sure he could pick it up and get something out of it, but it's like a sportsman that goes back in the ring or onto the field, knowing that they're not what they used to be. I think that's why people stop that kind of stuff, isn't it? Once if you've
Right.
been to the Olympics and won a gold medal, you tend to not run back and keep trying to run fast. You kind of go, that's me now. I did it and I'm gone. But it's a strange thing. And as I say, in an era where you couldn't go to a doctor and be diagnosed with depression. So he had to deal with it how he could.
Yeah, and I think it's important to stress to the non-musicians in our audience, that point of yours about how he eroded, Ronnie did, the part of him that was most necessary. Because if you're playing, for example, a woodwind instrument, you need a reed, right? And you need your teeth, and you need your mouth, and you need the muscles in your mouth,
yeah,
to play. So if you are contributing to the decay of the means by which you are able to enunciate and play through your instrument, then it becomes noticeable. I would, in the same way that voices change with singers as they get older, whether because of age or because of alcohol and drugs. You can hear in Miles Davis, for instance, when you get to the late 70s, early 80s, there is a difference in his playing, because I would speculate it has something to do with the degree to which cocaine, alcohol, and so forth degraded his ability to put that trumpet in his mouth and, wrap his lips around it and blow, and also lung capacity, right? So cigarettes also have a lot to do with how many notes you're able to project. So many artists will say that it's working around your physical limitations also create the conditions by which other people judge your art.
Or be Dizzy Gillespie and somehow
yes,
go beyond what seems to be physically possible.
My God.
And the neck muscles expanding, and I mean that's one of the
extraordinary
most, just that on the big screen. I'm pleased that there'll be people that'll be sitting there waiting for when the music performances really start to kick in, once just the way that expands is just something else. So yes, if the physicality of playing brass and woodwind, just watch that Dizzy Gillespie clip if you're not convinced that there's a important physical upkeep involved in playing. That's unreal.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're old enough or young enough to remember, as a child, for me, Dizzy Gillespie was woven into pop culture. He was on the Muppet Show. He was on the Cosby Show.
Sadly, we don't. I mean, I'm obviously aware of the Muppet. I think everyone is, but it's I didn't have access to the Muppets or the Cosby Show in the same way, unfortunately. But yeah,
It was he came first, as a child. I didn't know his genius on his instrument. It was, oh, he was the guy with the bullfrog cheeks that
yeah,
stretched, and I had forgotten that until I watched that clip in your documentary. I said, oh shit, that's amazing.
yeah,
At his age, he was still able to not just perform the notes. That's easy. That's the equivalent of someone playing, two notes in a guitar, but he's able to wring so much emotion out of what would have been blasted lungs or blasted cheeks. Was just, for me, it was a tear-inducing moment. It was fantastic.
yeah. Good.
I'm glad you included that. Um, in the documentary, at some point, you mentioned that Ronnie tried to avoid cocktail jazz, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and the phrase I often hear, especially during the '80s, from English friends, is that wine bar shite, right?
Wine bar shite. Yeah.
Yeah, so how did Ronnie survive during this era without succumbing to what he thought was inferior programming? And what was wine bar shite and cocktail jazz during this era? What did he keep out of his club?
I think it was. I think it was just the. When jazz clubs became kind of classy and cool, which must have been interesting from a generation where the original version of Ronnie's was a taxi driver's hangout.
Right.
It was literally it was just a basement. It was a place basically where cab drivers, prostitutes, and jazz musicians all hung up and got up to no good together in the small hours. And the idea that it goes from that to them entertaining Princess Anne, where she
Sure.
sort of famously used to hang out and had an affair with Peter Sellers, basically at Ronnie's, for the best part of a few months. I think that is huge. If that's not public knowledge, then go and take that. It's not like the royal family aren't in the papers already at the moment, but the
Oliver, if it's not in the Crown, it didn't happen.
yeah. Well, the I just think that people bought into it late, and they bought into it because it was a passing fad. So like anything, when people buy into it with a non-authentic drive, it comes and goes. So I think Ronnie's is just one of those places that lets fashions and fads and it just lets them sort of sail past, because they have an ethos that is older than any one individual that works there. It's a culture. It's a proper culture, and that's so hard to find, and especially now with property prices and
Yeah.
like London and New York and even like Paris now too. It's so hard for anyone to do what they did. And I remember I studied in New York for a few months when I was a student, and I was there for the last night of CBGB's.
Oh wow.
And just it's a similar place. It's just you never get another one, and there's loads of people that would like to try, but it's gone. It's a time and a place. So I think cocktail jazz and wine bar shite is just when someone thinks we will raise the kind of the bar of our establishment by getting a piano player in for an hour to kind of create a vibe. But it's really whether they know it or not,
right,
a cheap imitation of places like Ronnie's and all those clubs in the Village Vanguard and things like that. And so they come and go, those places.
So did this trend in mid-late '80s England, the everything but the girls and the Johnny Hates Jazzes, the ones who experimented with incorporating, I'm not going to say jazz, because jazz too many times is synonymous. Well, if we have a saxophone or some sort of woodwind, it's jazz. So what I'm saying is that Ronnie's ever hosts any of that kind of band. I'm not even going to mention Sade. That's sort of a different level, I think. For a lot of people, will probably say, well, Sade is also wine bar shite or real jazz. Not for me, but I don't know if Ronnie's would have considered her that.
I don't know if Sade played or not, actually, but they were definitely prepared to open up the stage to anyone. This is like why it. I think when you see the film, it makes total sense that Jimi Hendrix gets up on stage at somewhere like Ronnie's, because there's a musician who I think, if he was around today, I mean, I think he was certainly talking to Miles Davis about collaborating, and Santana, I think, filled his shoes in the end. Carlos Santana, I think that's how that all happened. But equally, that kind of fearlessness to change it up and go off piste a bit. As Simon, the managing director of Ronnie, says that, you know, that he holds on to the idea of when some purists say, oh, that's a weird booking, whatever, he kind of likes to say, well, you look all the way back to the early 60s. What you say is a weird booking happened all the time, and it was just whether or not they felt that the musicians were coming from an authentic place and had something to say. And I think that's ultimately, doesn't matter what kind of sound you're creating, it's about communicating a feeling, or it's trying to present a feel or a mood for an audience, and that is timeless.
Yeah, and anyone who was by this point has watched the documentary will appreciate that footage of Eric Burdon and Jimi Hendrix performing. And speaking for myself, you know, I wrote a piece about Dusty Springfield not too long ago, and Jimi Hendrix appeared. You know, Jimi Hendrix was on her variety show, and on first glance, you think, Jimi Hendrix at Dusty Springfield? But it's also a test to the Catholic, small C Catholic tastes of Ronnie or Dusty Springfield. They were able to hear some kind of kinship, what was going on, or if not hear one, at least have the curiosity to say, well, let's try this, and maybe we'll create the kinship.
Yeah, I think curiosity, once you lose your curiosity, I think that as a filmmaker, doesn't matter, or filmmaking, writing, music, you've got to be curious. You've got to try these things and go with your gut. And I was pleased that, like I say, I was not an expert on jazz at all. I mean, I honestly, I wasn't an expert on Ronnie Scott, but that was sort of the thing I harnessed. Was what I did have was an understanding that I was getting a really special opportunity to tell a story that I think will surprise quite a few people, because he's not a very famous global figure, but if you invest the time in his story, I think the story is a global and universal story about passion and about music. And I think it's a story about a kid with a dream. And we're going to need lots of kids with dreams when we're allowed to start leaving the house again. Otherwise, we're not going to get back a lot of what we've lost. So
absolutely.
I hope if it maybe some budding musicians or just people that are bored of being at home, if they kind of watch this film and can kind of take inspiration and go forth and put on nights, cinema screenings, whatever it is, we need to get out and have collective experiences again. And they're not going to happen by accident. They're only going to happen if we proactively get off the sofa or the couch, as you guys would say, and
the divan.
Let's make these things happen.
And that's actually my final question to you, Oliver. And most reporters will have started with this question, but I'm going to end. What is your connection to this material? Why Ronnie's? Why did it matter to you?
I think it mattered to me. It, as all good stories, and I've learned now that you have to kind of let it simmer for a bit. So I'd say when it was offered to me originally, and the reason why I wanted to take it on was it was, as I just said moments before, it is curiosity. And I thought, there is a great story here. I know enough to know that. And it was also a story of Soho, which is where I work. So that was an opportunity to tell a story about my hometown. So much of documentary making is about traveling and going and getting your stories.
Yes.
And this was
the Werner Herzog approach, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this was an opportunity to tell a story of the street I work on, that quite literally. And we edited it actually in the end on that street. So that was the original drive. But then as I got to know Ronnie, it's weird. You get, even though I'd obviously never met him, I feel like I know him through all of that footage and meeting all of these people. And I I connected with him in a way of, I mean, we're all kind of broken one way or another, if we admit it. And I think that
Speak for yourself.
well, yeah, I, I just find that you learn about yourself when you really start to interrogate other people's stories, and you start to learn about what makes you happy and what you want to do. I mean, when you make, my job is to make stories, either make them up when I'm working in fictional space, or discover the realities of individuals that do amazing things. And it does make you start to think, I want to do amazing things too. And so you say, well, I want to make the best possible films I can make. And
right.
Ronnie's the film, I guess, in a way is me on that journey of what Ronnie Scott was doing with his club. Is you just take your opportunities. It's a time and a place. Certainly now, I mean, God, if I knew that we were going to have the year we had, and just it's such a blessing that I had this opportunity to make the film, because the world's going to be a very different place, and I feel very blessed to have been able to tell Ronnie's story, to meet all those people. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. So there's always for every reason to make a film, there's always 100 reasons not to, because it's fucking hard. So I'm pleased that we stuck with it, and I had a great team. And this is still the journey now. Playing in places like Miami means that it's got a truly global audience. We had a show in Italy a couple of weeks ago, and we're off to Georgia with it. And it's just great to see these things take flight. It's not mine anymore. It's the audience's. It's for everyone now to enjoy and to take from it what they will. So I just can't wait to see what happens.
The director is Oliver Murray. The film was called Ronnie's. Oliver, thank you very much for this marvelous conversation.
Great. Thanks, Alfred. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to watch the movie. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but I'm very, very grateful.
And thank you, Miami Jewish Film Festival.